After Saul and Jonathan were killed, God directed David to go to the cities of Judah, and he dwelt in the city of Hebron. There the men of Judah came and anointed David as king over the house of Judah. But Abner, who had been the captain of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and made him king over Israel. David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah for 7 years and 6 months. Ishbosheth was king over Israel for 2 years. There was a long war between the house of David and the house of Saul. David became stronger and stronger, but the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. Abner had gone into Rizpah, Saul's concubine, and Ishbosheth confronted Abner about it. Upon hearing this, Abner threatened to turn the house of Saul over to David. Therefore Ishbosheth backed off and said no more. Abner appeared to switch sides. It appeared that he was willing to turn all of Ishbosheth's kingdom over to David. But Joab, David's captain, killed Abner because he took Abner to be a spy. Also, Abner had killed Joab's brother. However, before Abner was killed, and when he had sought to join David's rule and with him bring the kingdom back together with David required that he bring his wife Michal back to him. For Saul had taken his daughter Michal away from David when David had to leave because Saul was trying to kill him. Michal was David's first wife. She was the daughter of Saul, and he had given Michal to David for a price, 100 Philistine foreskins. Saul had stated this request of David, thinking David would be killed by the Philistines, which is what Saul wanted. Abner had come to David in peace, and David had received him and believed him. Then, after David sent him away, Joab came and heard that Abner had been there, and this angered him. So Joab went after him and killed him. This angered David a great deal, so much so that he spoke a curse on Joab's descendants. Then David had a ceremonial burial for Abner and honored him. When Ishbosheth heard of Abner's death, he grew weak and troubled. As he lay on his bed, 2 of his own men came in to him and killed him. They took his head to David, thinking he would be pleased. But David was not at all pleased, and he had them killed for killing a righteous man. So the elders of Israel came to David and made him king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. He reigned 7 years and 6 months in Hebron, and he reigned 33 years over all of Israel. After the tribes had come together as one nation, David and his men conquered Jerusalem, also called Zion, and the city of David. The Philistines came against them again, and David inquired of the Lord if they should go up and defeat them. The Lord said yes, but the next time after David inquired of the Lord, God gave the directions as to where they were to go, and then the Lord went out before them to smite the Philistines. The thing to note here is that David inquired of the Lord before he made a decision about going to war. Then David determined to bring the ark of God to Jerusalem, for it had been at the house of Abinadab. It was put on a cart pulled by oxen. On the way, Uzzah, who was walking alongside of the cart, put his hand up to steady the ark when the oxen shook it, and he was struck dead. This angered David, and he was afraid of the Lord. Instead of bringing it to the city of David as planned, he had it taken to the house of Obed-Edom. It was there for 90 days, and the house of Obed-Edom was blessed. Seeing how the Lord had blessed the house of Obed-Edom, David brought the ark to Jerusalem. In doing so, David danced with joy before the Lord, and David was wearing a linen ephod. This was something that only the priest wore, but for some reason God allowed David to dress in this. David had put aside his kingly robe to wear a priestly garment. This reminds me of Jesus Christ. Spiritually, Christ put aside his kingly garment to wear the priestly robe. Before Jesus lived here on the earth, he was in heaven with the Father. The earth had already been given to him to reign over. When he died, the veil in the temple was rent, and Christ took on the role as priest. Michal, David's wife, was angry as she saw David leaping and dancing, and she despised him. When she told him how she felt, his response to her was not friendly at all, and she had no child as long as she lived. Their relationship, as far as man and wife, was evidently ended. There was peace in the land now, for God had given them rest from all their enemies. David sat in his house and considered that there was no house for God. He lived in a house of cedar, but the ark dwelled behind curtains. So David wished to build a house for God. God promised that David's kingdom would prosper and that his name would be great, but it would be his son who would build a house for God's name. God promised also that David's kingdom would last forever. David continued to defeat his enemies. For those he didn't kill, he kept as servants and forced them to pay tribute. He also took much spoil from the nations he subdued, and he dedicated the spoil to the Lord. David wanted to show mercy to the house of Saul for Jonathan's sake. It was reported to him that Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth, who was lame on both feet. David assigned all property that had been Jonathan's to Mephibosheth, but his servant Ziba would be over all the property to have it tilled and properly taken care of. Mephibosheth was to eat at David's table for the rest of his life. One of the most well-known of the Bible stories is the story of David and Bathsheba. David sees her and lusts after her. Then he sends for her, commits adultery, and she goes back home. Then she notifies him later that she is pregnant. He has her husband Uriah, who is in David's army, come home for a rest. It is his intention that Uriah sleep with his wife, but he didn't, because he would not go into his wife as long as his men were sleeping in open fields. Then David had Uriah sent to the front lines, and he had also given orders that the other men were to withdraw from the battle so as to leave Uriah alone with the enemy. Of course, Uriah was killed. Then David had the freedom to marry Bathsheba, and they had a son. So the Lord sent Nathan to David, and Nathan told him of a story where a poor man had only one little lamb, which he and his family loved. And there was a rich man who had much. But when a traveler came to visit him, he took the poor man's lamb to dress it for food for the visitor, instead of taking from his own flock. David was furious and said the man should die. Nathan said, "You are the man." When the Lord spoke to David about this, he said, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel." David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan said to David, "The Lord has put away your sin. You won't die, but the child will die." David fasted and prayed for the baby before it died, because he didn't know if perhaps the Lord would be gracious to him and heal the child. But when the baby died, he said, "I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me." David and Bathsheba had another son. He was David's 10th son, and his name was Solomon. Another son of David's, Absalom, had a beautiful sister named Tamar. A half-brother to Absalom, Amnon lusted after Tamar and raped her. Absalom sought to kill him, and finally did have his servants kill Amnon for raping Tamar. Then Absalom fled to another city to live. David mourned for both the dead son and for the son in exile. After 3 years, David had Absalom to be brought back to his home, but David didn't see him for 2 years. Then Joab arranged a plan for David to see how wrong he was to not see Absalom. Finally, David allowed Joab to bring Absalom to David, and their relationship was restored. It was David's responsibility to put away his son that had raped Tamar, but he did nothing. So much later, he was able to accept that Absalom had done what he should have done, and he, David, was comforted concerning Amnon. Sometime after this, Absalom, who was full of pride, began to do things in the sight of the people that would endear him to them. It worked, and the people began to pay a lot of attention to Absalom. When he plotted to make himself king of Hebron, the message got to David, who fled from Jerusalem along with all his servants, for Absalom was headed with his men for Jerusalem. It was agreed that one of David's faithful servants would go back to Jerusalem and claim to serve Absalom as he had served David, but he was really to be a spy and get word back to David about what was going on with Absalom in Jerusalem. Also, Ahithophel, who had been David's advisor, changed his position and now followed Absalom as his advisor. Ahithophel counseled Absalom to go in and sleep with the 10 concubines of David that he had left behind to take care of at the house. Absalom did what Ahithophel advised, for Ahithophel had said when Absalom did that, David would despise him, and the people would change their allegiance to Absalom. Ahithophel had also counseled Absalom as to how to go about defeating David. David's servant spy, Hushai, gave differing advice. Absalom took the advice of Hushai, and then Ahithophel went home and hanged himself. Hushai had sent word to David to do such and such, which was different advice than that he had given Absalom. So David was able to avoid being in the place where Absalom would be attacking, for Hushai had sent Absalom's battle plans to David. This gave David time to mobilize his army. When Absalom's army was on its way, David's people urged him not to go to battle, for he was more important than they. So David stayed back, but he told his 3 commanders to deal gently with his son Absalom. The battle was fierce, and 20,000 were killed. When Absalom rode his mule under a tree, his thick hair got caught in the tree, and he was left hanging by his hair in the tree. Joab then thrust 3 darts into Absalom's heart when his men would not raise their hands against the king's son. Then 10 young men that were Joab's armor-bearers killed Absalom. Joab reproached David for his attitude towards the people. He said, "You would have been happier if your son had lived and we all had died. You should get up and go out and see the people." So David did just that. He got up and went out and sat at the gate, and the people came out before him, for they had fled to their tents. There are other uprisings and revolts in David's kingdom. The country is not at peace. This is something God had spoken against David's kingdom after he had Uriah killed. 2 Samuel 12:10 says, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife." Some time later there was a famine for 3 years. David called upon the Lord concerning the famine, and God told him it was because Saul had slain the Gibeonites. Remember that earlier Joshua had made a treaty with the Gibeonites not to fight against them. They had deceived him, but nevertheless he had failed to consult God and had made a peace treaty with them. David went to the Gibeonite king and asked what he could do to atone for what Saul had done. The king wanted 7 of Saul's descendants to be executed. David agreed to this, but he did not let them have Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. After this, the Philistines came again up against Israel. David was at this time weak, and his men would not allow him to go to battle with them any more, and they slew the giants. And David praised God for all the victories he had given him. The story is told of a time when 3 of David's mighty men risked their own lives to go and get water from a well in Bethlehem, because David had said, "Oh, that one would give me a drink of the water of the well at Bethlehem." These 3 men went through enemy territory to get the water for David because they loved him so much and would literally do anything for him. When they brought the water to him, he poured it out on the ground and to the Lord, saying, "Be it far from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Is not this the blood of the men that went in jeopardy of their lives?" To David, the water was too precious to drink, so he offered it to the Lord. In chapter 23 are listed the names of all of David's mighty men, 37 in all. It's interesting that Uriah the Hittite, whom David had killed, was named among them. David called Joab to number the men of Israel and Judah. This was not God's will, and it angered him. He sent Gad the prophet to tell David he could choose one of 3 things that the Lord would do because of this sin. The 3 choices were a famine for 7 years, David could flee 3 months before his enemies, or 3 days' pestilence in the land. Then David said to Gad, "Let us fall now into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, and let me not fall into the hand of man." So the Lord sent a pestilence on the land, and 70,000 people died. When the angel stretched out his hand upon Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord repented of the evil and said to the angel that destroyed the people, "It is enough, stay now thine hand." The angel of the Lord was by the threshing place of Araunah the Jebusite. And David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel and said, "Lo, I have sinned, and I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let thine hand, I pray, be against me and my father's house." So Gad came that day and told David to build an altar to the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David told Araunah he wanted to buy the threshing floor, but Araunah said he would give it to David. Then David said he would not offer burnt offerings unto the Lord if it didn't cost him anything. So he bought the threshing floor and the oxen to offer for 50 shekels of silver, and the plague was stayed from Israel. And this ends the book of 2 Samuel.